grip of drought that is intensifying in the West has led scientists to turn to an unusual ally in the fight to limit the effects of climate change.
They knew the land was beyond saving. They released the beavers anyway. Not a small group. Not a trial run. Thousands of animals, removed from suburban canals, agricultural ditches, retention ponds where they'd become a nuisance, and intentionally placed into some of the most devastated terrain in Florida. Land so drained, degraded, and damaged that the scientists assigned to evaluate it had quietly stopped scheduling follow-up visits. There was nothing left to study. There was nothing left to rescue. The people behind this decision knew exactly what kind of environment they were sending those animals into. No trees. No reliable water. Soil so hardened and fractured it seemed to have forgotten what moisture was. They knew the critics called it cruel. They knew the chances. They released them anyway. What happened next on that land, land that had been officially, professionally, scientifically written off, is the reason you clicked on this video. And I can promise you this, nothing you think you know about damaged ecosystems could have prepared you for what those animals created out of almost nothing. The dead zones. To understand why any of this matters, you first need to understand what that land had already become. This was not habitat that simply needed a little assistance. This was not land that had been briefly disrupted. This was land that had been fundamentally broken, engineered into dysfunction over decades, and had been steadily declining ever since. Florida's wetlands are among the most ecologically important systems on the continent. A healthy Florida wetland filters water, softens storm surge, stores carbon, replenishes the aquifer beneath it, and supports a concentration of wildlife that few ecosystems can rival. It is not merely beautiful scenery. It is a working system, gradual, layered, self-sustaining, that moves water across the landscape in ways that make everything downstream, everything nearby, and everything above it possible. Over the years, vast portions of that system had been intentionally dismantled. Drainage ditches were excavated to make room for agriculture and development. Natural waterways were straightened and deepened to move surface water away as fast as possible. The slow, spreading sheet flow that once defined these wetlands was disrupted. Seasonal pools disappeared. The land was deliberately redesigned to shed water instead of retaining it. At the time, it looked like progress. Fields could be cultivated. Roads remained dry. But the hidden cost of all that drainage was already building beneath the surface. The more a wetland is drained, the harder it becomes to recover. Water that once moved gradually across the landscape began rushing away through straight channels. Organic material that had accumulated in the soil for centuries started oxidizing and breaking down. The ground dried out. It cracked. It compacted. And without vegetation to slow rainfall, water moved even faster, which dried the soil further, which killed more plants, which accelerated water loss yet again. A feedback loop accelerating in exactly the wrong direction. By the time restoration planners began conducting formal site assessments, what they found looked more like an environmental disaster zone. Long, straight ditches cutting through open, sun-scorched ground. Low areas that should have remained permanently moist instead filled briefly after rain before returning to cracked clay within 48 hours. Native vegetation was almost entirely gone. The landscape had not merely lost the appearance of health. It had lost the underlying process that allowed health to return. And this is the part that most discussions of these sites overlooked completely. A landscape that looks damaged can often recover on its own with enough time. Natural succession has revived ecosystems that once seemed beyond saving. But these sites had lost something even more essential than vegetation. They had lost their hydrology. The water dynamics that make biological recovery possible had been erased. Without water remaining in the soil long enough to support new plant growth, nothing permanent could establish itself. Rain would arrive and disappear. Anything that tried to return kept running into the same invisible barrier. The water simply would not stay. Traditional restoration had a familiar answer to this problem. Rebuild by hand what drainage had destroyed. Regrade the land. Install water control structures. Plug drainage channels. Introduce native plants. Reconstruct the ecosystem piece by piece over years, sometimes decades, with engineers, contractors, project managers, permits, and constant oversight. It was a defensible strategy. It looked solid in grant proposals. It was also extraordinarily expensive at the scale these sites required, painfully slow, and, if the evidence was evaluated honestly, not consistently successful even when fully funded. Restored systems often needed continuous intervention just to remain wet. The land kept trying to drain itself. Keeping it saturated meant fighting that battle indefinitely. That was the reality facing the agencies responsible for these dead zones. Degraded land that continued to degrade. Restoration methods that were financially unrealistic at the necessary scale. And an animal, the nuisance beaver, the canal-blocking, infrastructure-damaging suburban troublemaker, that most wildlife managers viewed as something to remove, not protect. Then, at some point, someone asked a different question. What if the problem and the solution were the very same animal? The risk behind the plan. The beaver is often called nature's engineer. That phrase has been repeated so many times that it no longer carries much impact. In reality, it barely captures what a beaver is capable of when it enters a landscape. A beaver does not simply live around water. A beaver creates water. It finds any flow it can access, a stream, a seep, a rain-fed channel, a drainage ditch, and begins blocking it. Methodically. Relentlessly. It packs mud, sticks, roots, and vegetation into any opening that allows water to pass, continuing to build until the water stops moving forward and starts spreading outward. Behind each structure, water accumulates. It expands across low ground. It soaks into the soil. It raises local groundwater levels. It forms ponds where none existed days earlier. It transforms a straight drainage channel into a growing pocket of moisture. And a single colony does not stop after building one dam. It constructs several, repairs them after storms, enlarges them over time, and then creates additional structures farther upstream, a stair-stepped network of impoundments that can stretch for hundreds of meters and hold far more water than most people would ever expect from animals working with mud and sticks. Sediment slows and settles. Organic matter begins to accumulate. Soil chemistry starts to change. Carbon storage increases. Microbial communities, dormant within dry, compacted ground, come back to life. The entire ecological foundation of a functioning wetland begins rebuilding itself. Not because of a management plan. Not because of a restoration project. Because beavers are doing exactly what beavers have always done. The dead zones did not need cosmetic improvements. They did not need tree planting campaigns or large-scale grass seeding along their edges. They needed the one thing decades of drainage had taken away: water that remained in place. If beavers could find even a trace of flow within those damaged channels and begin slowing it down, the landscape might start retaining moisture again. And if moisture remained, everything else might follow. The objections came almost immediately. Florida's degraded zones were nearly devoid of trees. What building material were the beavers supposed to use? The answer turned out to be far more adaptable than critics expected. Beavers prefer wood, but they work with whatever is available: reeds, rushes, cattail stalks, root mats, and accumulated organic debris. They do not need a forest-lined stream to begin reshaping a landscape. They need opportunity, moving water, and the instinct to stop it. Even a narrow artificial drainage ditch can become a starting point. The animals would not be constructing classic woodland ponds right away. They would be improvising. The question was whether that improvisation would be enough. Public meetings grew heated. Biologists debated carrying capacity. Landowners worried about flooding. Some conservationists argued the animals were being placed in conditions destined to cause suffering. Others pointed to a more uncomfortable reality: nuisance beavers removed from suburban areas were often euthanized. Relocation at least gave them a chance to serve an ecological purpose with whatever time they had left. State officials were confronting a different calculation. The dead zones continued to decline. The cost of doing nothing was real, even if it accumulated quietly over time. Inaction carried a price of its own. Critics kept asking whether beavers belonged on land this degraded. Supporters began asking a sharper question. What if land this degraded could not recover without them? At that point, nobody knew the answer. That uncertainty, specific, intense, and carrying real consequences on both sides, is exactly what made everything that followed so impossible to ignore. The releases. Once the decision was finalized, the operation moved fast. Wildlife teams began gathering nuisance beavers from problem locations across the state. Canal banks. Retention ponds in residential developments. Agricultural drainage corridors. Culvert systems beneath rural roadways. Every animal had to be trapped, evaluated for transport suitability, relocated under carefully managed welfare conditions, and released at designated points within the restoration zones. Beavers are not easy animals to move. They are large, territorial, powerful, and remarkably uncooperative when handled by humans. Relocating them at scale across multiple sites, while maintaining proper welfare standards, required ongoing coordination between state wildlife agencies, licensed trappers, and field crews operating across a wide geographic area. The logistics were complicated. The expenses were substantial. And the pressure to produce visible results before skepticism turned into political resistance was already growing. By the time the first major wave of releases was underway, opinions had hardened into two clear camps. On one side were those who believed a biologically driven solution to an otherwise overwhelming restoration challenge was exactly what the scale of the damage required. On the other were those convinced they were witnessing a publicly funded exercise in optimism detached from reality. Both sides had cameras positioned at the release sites. Both had observers monitoring conditions in the field. One group was waiting to witness something remarkable. The other was waiting for proof that their doubts had been justified. And in those first few weeks, what they saw looked much closer to the second outcome. The wait before everything changed. The first few weeks were unsettling. The sites did not suddenly come alive with activity. The beavers did not immediately start building. They wandered across open, unfamiliar terrain with little sign of direction. Some groups scattered before establishing any stable territory. Individual animals traveled well beyond expected boundaries, searching for conditions that simply did not exist yet. The landscape was too exposed. Too unlike the environments they had been removed from. Then came the losses. Several animals died in the weeks after release, some from transport-related stress, some taken by predators, and some that simply vanished without any confirmed explanation. Monitoring teams were submitting reports that offered little reassurance. Entire portions of the target sites showed no signs of construction at all. The beavers were present on the landscape. They were not yet acting as engineers. Critics responded exactly as expected. The project was labeled wasteful. The animals were described as victims of an expensive and misguided experiment. For weeks, the entire effort seemed trapped in an uncomfortable space between bold ambition and visible failure. Then, on a Tuesday morning, a motion-activated camera positioned along a degraded drainage corridor on the eastern edge of one site captured something unusual. The field monitoring coordinator reviewing the overnight footage nearly skipped past the timestamp. The image was dark. The quality was poor. What he saw was so small and indistinct that he initially assumed it was simply debris washed into the channel by recent rain. It was not debris. It was a rough obstruction. Stems, mud, and fragments of vegetation packed into a narrow gap where shallow water was flowing through. Small, messy, easy to overlook. But water was gathering behind it. Slow-moving, shallow water that had not been there before. He replayed the footage. Watched it a second time. Then reached for his phone. That was the moment the project stopped being a theory. Within days, similar obstructions appeared in nearby sections. They were not impressive structures, just enough material placed in just the right locations to interrupt flow and force water outward. Small pools remained longer after rainfall. Saturated ground spread beyond the channels. Areas that previously dried out within hours of a storm now stayed dark and soft for days. The beavers had discovered the weak points in the drainage system. And once they began taking advantage of them, a chain of events started that no restoration budget and no engineering model had predicted. The cascade of recovery. Here is what most people fail to consider when water is finally allowed to remain in a damaged landscape. It does not solve just one problem. It restores the conditions that allow countless other problems to begin solving themselves. More standing water created safer movement corridors, which led to more dam building. Increased moisture allowed rushes, sedges, and reeds to recover, providing beavers with additional construction material, which resulted in larger and more durable structures. Sediment that once washed downstream began settling behind those barriers instead. Organic matter accumulated. Microbial activity that had been dormant in the dry, compacted soil came back to life. Carbon started rebuilding within the ground. Seeds that had remained buried in the seed bank for years, suspended in a state of biological waiting for conditions that never arrived, finally received the moisture they needed to germinate. Each improvement increased the likelihood of the next. That is how ecological recovery works when the primary obstacle is removed. It does not progress at a constant pace. It gains momentum. By the end of the first full season, monitoring wells showed groundwater remaining in place longer between rainfall events. Satellite imagery revealed persistent moisture patterns in areas that had previously dried almost immediately. The transformation was still fragile. It was uneven. Some experts continued to question it. But it was measurable, and it continued to grow. Beaver colonies established territories. Ongoing dam maintenance transformed temporary puddles into semi-stable ponds. And once those ponds became reliable, everything that depends on stable water began to arrive. Vegetation came first. Emergent plants spread across muddy shorelines. Thick stands of sedge appeared where bare, compacted soil had once dominated. The land had not lost all of its biological potential. Much of it had simply been dormant, waiting for the hydrology to change. Once it did, life responded far faster than restoration plans had predicted. Then came the birds. Wading species moved into the newly formed shallows. Waterfowl began using ponds that had not existed a year earlier. The entire soundscape shifted. Places that had once been silent now echoed with water, movement, and living activity. For the people monitoring the sites, it felt less like a restoration project and more like an ecosystem powering itself back on. But the visible changes were only the beginning. The real test was happening beneath the surface. And what was taking place underground would determine whether any of this transformation could endure. Beneath the surface. As water slowed and spread across the landscape, fine sediment that had once been carried downstream began settling behind beaver-built structures, forming a soft, biologically active layer of organic-rich material. And that material was far more than simple mud. It was the foundation from which wetland soil is created. Wetland soil stores carbon, supports root networks, filters pollutants, and creates the conditions that allow wetland ecosystems to sustain themselves for generations. Before the beavers arrived, that foundation had been steadily eroding. The soil was losing its biological memory, the accumulated legacy of centuries of wet conditions that influences everything from soil chemistry to microbial life. What the beavers were doing, without a restoration blueprint, without any awareness of the data being collected around them, was reversing that decline. They were not merely creating ponds. They were rebuilding the physical platform upon which a lasting wetland depends. And there is an important distinction here. An engineered pond is not the same thing as a functioning wetland. A true wetland contains layered, biologically active soil, microbes cycling nutrients, and root systems holding sediment in place. It carries the accumulated biological memory of decades of wet conditions, a memory that cannot be manufactured overnight, but can be reawakened when the right environmental conditions return. The beavers became the trigger for that reawakening. The clearest example emerged in areas where multiple colonies established themselves along a single damaged drainage corridor. Working independently, yet producing a combined effect, they transformed the corridor into a stair-stepped chain of impoundments. Water backed up from one structure to the next. What had once been a fast-draining channel gradually began to resemble a natural marsh. Shrubs appeared along the edges. Woody vegetation started taking hold in places where almost no one expected it to survive. The beavers had not waited for trees to arrive. They had created the conditions that would eventually allow trees to return. In effect, they were building the very prerequisites their future habitat required. The evidence became impossible to ignore. As the project moved beyond its fragile early stage, the data began building a case that even longtime skeptics struggled to dismiss. Groundwater levels showed measurable increases. Wetland coverage expanded year after year. Species inventories grew with every annual survey: more birds, more amphibians, more invertebrates, and more mammals moving through the restored wet corridors. Slowly but unmistakably, the system was shifting away from one that required constant human intervention and toward one capable of sustaining itself. Then came the kind of evidence that transforms an intriguing experiment into a serious ecological case study. It did not come from a laboratory. It came from a drought. During the dry season, the contrast between beaver-modified areas and the surrounding landscape became obvious even to people simply passing by. Nearby areas browned as expected. Vegetation withered. The ground became pale, dry, and hard. Yet within the zones where beaver activity was most concentrated, vegetation remained green longer. The soil stayed dark. Pockets of surface water persisted in places where, only a few years earlier, none would have survived. The system was not just healthier during favorable conditions. It was more resilient when conditions became difficult. Moist ground acts as a natural defense against drought. Water-saturated soil retains moisture that would otherwise evaporate, extending survival for plants, animals, and microbial communities during periods of intense heat. In fire-prone landscapes, and much of Florida falls into that category, persistent wet areas can slow or interrupt fire spread, providing protection for both wildlife and nearby infrastructure. A beaver-built wetland is more than habitat. It is infrastructure, water storage, drought resilience, fire resistance, wildlife refuge. And it delivers all of that without construction contracts, maintenance crews, or project managers. The beavers were accomplishing, at virtually no ongoing cost, something that millions of dollars in engineered restoration projects had struggled to achieve at scale. Eventually, the groundwater data reached federal restoration planners who had not participated in the original effort. By most accounts, they were not expecting what they found. But the most compelling evidence was never contained in a spreadsheet. It was visible in what the land had become, and in what that transformation suggested about countless other damaged landscapes still being managed according to the same assumptions that had once governed this one. What the recovery really revealed. Beavers are not a universal answer to every environmental problem. This project worked because the conditions were right, residual water flow remained, sites were carefully selected, and the process was actively monitored. Release the wrong animals into the wrong environment, and the outcome can be new damage rather than restoration. That distinction matters. But it does not change what happened here. What Florida demonstrated is that many landscapes people label as too damaged to recover may not be missing thousands of separate ecological pieces. Instead, they may be missing one or two critical processes that, once restored, allow everything else to follow naturally. In this case, that process was water retention. Simply keeping water on the landscape long enough to restart the feedback loops that create ecological complexity. The beavers solved that problem directly, consistently, and at a fraction of the cost of any comparable alternative. And here is the part that should make you pause. Almost everyone assumed that the lack of trees meant beavers had no chance of succeeding. But the missing trees were never the real problem. The missing hydrology was. The trees were simply one of many things that would return once water returned. Open, treeless ground gradually became rich with shrubs. Shrub-filled margins added structural complexity. Moist edges created opportunities for woody vegetation to establish itself. The habitat deficit was not solved overnight. It was corrected step by step season after season, with each site looking a little less like an abandoned scar and a little more like a place with a future. Water spread across former drainage channels. Mud trapped seeds. Green replaced brown. Straight channels softened into marshy edges. The sounds of wildlife replaced silence. The beavers built retention. They built stability. They built the foundation that allowed everything else to rebuild itself. And that raises a larger question. How many landscapes classified as degraded are not missing thousands of individual fixes, but only one or two essential forces? How many so-called dead zones are not truly dead at all, but dormant, waiting for the right catalyst to wake them up? No one has a complete answer. But the question is now being asked in ways it never was before. In the end, the story of Florida's dead zones is really a story about assumptions being overturned. The assumption that a drained, treeless landscape could not support beavers. Overturned. The assumption that relocating beavers there would fail almost immediately. Overturned. The assumption that meaningful restoration must come from large-scale engineered solutions imposed from the outside. Overturned. The assumption that biological processes move too slowly to matter in severely degraded environments. Overturned. None of those outcomes were guaranteed. They depended on careful site selection, patience through an early stage that looked very much like failure, and the willingness to stay committed when criticism was loud and success remained invisible. But once those conditions were in place, the beavers handled the rest. A landscape engineered to drain itself was gradually persuaded to hold water again. Fast-moving runoff became stored water. Stored water became moist soil. Moist soil became plant growth. Plant growth became food and shelter. Food and shelter attracted wildlife. Wildlife transformed the area from a degraded landscape into a living, functioning ecological network. Step by step, dam by dam, the animals that many people expected to fail ended up rebuilding the missing engine of the ecosystem. Not because they were extraordinary. Not because they did anything new. But because they did exactly what they have always done. Hydrological engineers. Ecosystem catalysts. Living earth movers working on the one thing damaged landscapes need most, slowing water down long enough for life to catch up. Florida did not release beavers into a paradise. It released them into some of the most damaged land in the state. And when you compare what that land became to what it once was, there is only one word that truly fits. Unbelievable.